Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest Common Knowledge event. My name is Glenn Telfer, and I'm hosting the event for Professor Richard Enos, who would normally be here, but obviously he can't be here today, hence you've got me. Before I introduce our speaker, Sonia, I'd like to say a few words about Common Knowledge and about the format for today's talk. So Common Knowledge, who are hosting this event, are a group of people from Edinburgh that initially got together in resistance to the COVID mandates. And as time went by, I think probably like a lot of us here, we started to understand that COVID was just one part, one element of a much wider agenda that was aimed against us. And all these random, disparate, crazy things that have been happening over the last 20 years are in fact connected. And what to do about that was the question. So in the kind of fizzling out of the issue connected with COVID and the mask mandates and the vaccinations, we decided, Richard Enos, the chairman of this, decided to form a little group and see who wanted to join. And a lot of us joined together to make this group to see what we could do about it. So we do a number of things. One of the things is we host events like this, like a knowledge event, where we have speakers come with an expertise in some area and give us some idea of what's going on in the world, because a lot of it doesn't make sense until you hear someone actually that's investigated it. So we've got different types of knowledge events. We've got lots of community events, because one thing that probably most of us experienced over the last few years, particularly when COVID first started, was a sense of isolation, of having no one to talk to, particularly if you were a skeptic. And so Common Knowledge is like a group of skeptics that kind of think the same way about most things. So we also have community events where we just get together with kind of like-minded people and just talk about all kinds of things. So it's not all conspiracy talk by any means, but it's just a way of connecting with humans. I mean, one of the big ideas for us going forward is that we need to make communities among ourselves that are face-to-face, that are real people and not online ones, because all the online things are actually dividing us. And we're also trying to do practical things, because in the end, everything else is just talk. And we've got a number of practical initiatives, some of them in the political sphere and some of them in the more kind of cultural and economic sphere. And one thing that was started recently that we're very proud of is a thing called a RECO ring. Now, some of you might not have heard of that, but it's basically an initiative that started in Scandinavia a generation or so ago to connect concerned food consumers, probably like ourselves, with concerned producers. And those of it are looking at what's happening with food, how corrupted a lot of it is, the role of the supermarkets, the digitalisation of purchasing and that coming into the supermarkets. And we're concerned about not just the quality of the food, but the security of it. Because it's not hard to envisage a time in the future where you're denied certain things because your social credit isn't sufficient. So we had an idea, and the RECO ring connects people that think that way with the people that also think that way, that produce it, that are concerned about animal husbandry and about soil quality and about good farming practices and an ethical environment. So the RECO ring is something I think it's going to be a big idea going forward for those that are concerned about what's happening and what they're eating. So it's a great privilege to introduce our guest speaker today, Sonia Poulton. Now, I've been thinking this, often when someone gives a talk, they say it's a great privilege and that type of thing, and it's like it sounds like a cliche and a puffed up thing to say, but in the case of Sonia, if any of you looked at her work, you know this most definitely isn't the case. In an age where so many journalists are false faces, double agents, and even when they're not, their standards are incredibly low, Sonia stands out. Now, I know there are others like her, but she's the one that's here right now, and this is true-hearted, brave journalism. There's no question on that, because all of us here probably know that when you cross people that are forcing this agenda, things happen to you. You know, they might talk about free speech and about truth and the truth community and stuff like that, but they're no respecters of it if you get in their way. And if anyone knows this is Sonia. So in our minds we're all heroes, but in fact when it comes to us, some of us we take the rational way out, and Sonia definitely hasn't done that, and she made a lot of powerful enemies. And I would like to personally salute that, Sonia. Yeah. I think that if it wasn't for you, if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't know anything about this. So this is like, and it's a eulogy to you, but it's like spiritual strength and moral courage, and it has to be saluted, because we would all be in the dark about all these things going on, and if anybody said anything, we would think they were crazy. But you brought forward evidence, and it can't be denied, so respect for that. So enough of me, so I'm now going to hand over to our guest speaker today, Sonia Poulton. Sonia, thank you.
I want to say thank you so much to Common Knowledge for bringing me here. I love Edinburgh. It is one of my favourite cities, and I'm not just saying it because I'm here. It genuinely is. As some of my friends in the audience actually know, I feel like this. So thank you so much, Common Knowledge, all of you, for bringing me here. I am so grateful to you. And thank you all for coming as well. It's a brilliant turnout, and I'm so grateful for that as well. And Glenn was incredibly kind, but obviously it takes a village to raise the particular child of truth. So there's lots and lots of people who are working on it, and I'm just one of those. So I'm here to tell you a little bit about my work, what it entails, the troubles that come with being an investigative journalist. So I'm, as you know, an investigative journalist and a broadcaster, and I do that because I fell on my head as a baby. And I say that without a joke. I actually did fall on my head as a baby, and over these 59 years of my life, I have to keep looking back and saying, why did I pursue this career? And I keep coming back to the same thing. But it's fine. It's absolutely fine. I love what I do, and I'm very grateful to be able to do what I do. And the fact is I just love the truth, however I find it. And oftentimes, the truth isn't necessarily what I want it to be. I am politically homeless. I don't come with any agendas, despite what some people may think about me. But I don't. I follow the truth, and that is what excites me. And that is what I am passionate about. And there are some areas of this world that have intrigued me more than others. And the invisible hand of what goes on in our world has always intrigued me, because for a very long time, my mum was a medium, so I was not raised in the most conventional of ways. I was raised around a séance table. I assumed that everybody was until I was 18 years old and moved to London. And then I discovered that no, not everybody is raised exactly the same way as you are. But what it enabled me to see was that life is different. It comes in different shades and different colours, and not everybody is the same. But what my mum taught me, my mum died when I was 11, and actually up to that point, those 11 years of my life, she packed so much into those years that by the time that she departed this earth, I felt more than equipped actually to venture into the world, which may sound odd for an 11-year-old, but that was exactly what happened. And so by the age of 18, I'd moved from my little village in Gloucestershire. I live with my brothers and sisters. They're older than me. I moved from our village, our town in Gloucestershire, Cirencester, and I moved to London because I instinctively felt that there was a big adventure out there for me. I had no idea, literally no idea. Naivety couldn't even cut it. I began working for newspapers when I was about 22 years old. My first job was as an editorial assistant for the London newspaper group. It was 16 newspapers in central and west London, and my job was to open the post and make the coffee. And I couldn't make coffee, and I could just about open the post, but the editor was brilliant. Ray Fox come in, and within about 6 months, he realised that I had some abilities. Even though I'd left school with barely any qualifications, because the odd thing is, when you become an orphan at 11, education is not the major thing that you're concerned about. Survival is. And do you know what? I wouldn't change a thing about my life. I literally wouldn't. And the reason I say that is because I'm very blessed to be here right now and have an overview of what it all entails and what each stage has led me to. So I began working for London Newspaper Group. Within 6 months, I was running the entertainment section. And I was basically trained on the job. It's not something that happens now in journalism. A lot of the time, you often have to go through really expensive journalism courses. Well, I didn't. And so I literally learned on the job. And actually, it was the best way to do. And that you can't, in terms of journalism, you can't do better than starting off at a local level, because that's when you find out how things work. And I started to understand, and this was the time when Shirley Porter was running Westminster, and she was involved in basic basically, you know, her and her party and her team, they were involved in essentially buying votes and in exchange for properties. There was all manner of things that were taking place. And I was quite shocked. I didn't really think that there was necessarily this level of corruption in the world. But bit by bit, I started to understand that the world is, we live in sort of parallel dimensions. There is this world that we're all told about, the official narrative of everything, and then there's the real world. And the official narrative, as I've learnt over my years in journalism, which is now 3 decades, so I'd spent the initial 12 years as a music journalist, and that was really eye-opening and insightful for me. I was a hip-hop journalist, and that was really at the start of everything to do with hip-hop. And I was really blessed, and I got to tour with people like, you know, with bands like Public Enemy and Snoop Dogg and Puff Daddy, although obviously clearly not necessarily a name I should be banding around now. And I was one of the last journalists to interview the Notorious Big before he was murdered. And what I learned from these people was about this dark side of the music industry that I didn't know about up to that point. And actually I was introduced to the whole idea of what they then, and probably still do, called the, you know, the sort of the music Illuminati when I was very young. Probably about 24, 25, which is quite young actually to be plunged into all of that. But I felt that the time leading up to that had prepared me for all of this. So after I had spent about 12 years as a music journalist, my daughter was born. And the great thing about music journalism is that all the perks are in the job. You don't get paid a lot of money, but I got to travel. I had an extensive music catalogue. I went to any concert that I wanted to. But the thing about it is you can't feed a child a CD, because Lord knows I did contemplate it on several occasions. I ended up one winter selling my entire vinyl collection in order to be able to feed and clothe my daughter. And again, I don't regret a single thing about it, because these things are what make you. And so bit by bit, I started to branch more into investigative journalism. The first piece that I ever wrote after music journalism was about the poison that came from breast implants. And because the thing about music journalism and the type that I was doing, it was very much about society. It wasn't pop music. It was about the problems that are going on in society and societal woes. So I was always interested in injustices. My mum was exactly the same. My family are exactly the same. I hate any form of injustice, because I believe that all injustices are connected in one way or another. And there's usually the same essential elements that move injustices. And so that always interested me. But bit by bit, I started to move in certain circles. And these circles were getting crazier and crazier, and I was hearing crazier and crazier stories. But the thing about me is I won't pass on rumours, because we don't need that level of mis or disinformation in this story. What I will do, though, is I will allow people to question scenarios. We now live in a sort of post-truth era where you're not allowed to even question basic stuff. So the woman who would be queen doesn't appear for 6 months, but we're all supposed to just accept it and not ask any questions. And we don't have to make, yeah, and I am aware that she appeared at Troop in the Colour today, by the way. But the point is that some people say you shouldn't be asking those questions. No, you should. You absolutely should. The moment you have a question, you should be able to ask it, because I am absolutely aware that in our world, the freedom to speak has become increasingly problematic. And I do understand that free speech has to come with consequences. Of course it does. But not necessarily the type that the SNP or them in Westminster think we should be adhering to, because their idea of hate speech is not my idea of hate speech, but there are laws, obviously. So you have to be careful. So bit by bit, I started to explore more and more areas that were interesting me. And for one example, when the Jimmy Savile revelations occurred in 2012, and when Tom Watson stood up in the Houses of Parliament and said to David Cameron, I believe, and I have been told, we have intel, that there have been rings, paedophile rings linked to Parliament. And this was already playing into everything that I was starting to understand about the way the world was moving. And at that time, at 2012, I was campaigning heavily against the coalition government. David Cameron and Nick Clegg, they came together in a particularly demonic union against people, and they started to drive through measures which were absolutely horrendous, which were impacting the sick and disabled, and they were pushing for new measures to do with the health and social care bill, and they wanted to further privatise the NHS. Well, I came from a good working class background, and I really respected and appreciated the NHS, and I certainly wasn't going to allow it just to be taken like that. So I became very active in campaigning against the health and social care bill, as well as the welfare reform bill, because it seemed absolutely apparent to me that we were dumping on some of the most vulnerable in society. And the thing about me is I have what I call a family committee. They're all dead, but they're my family committee, and that's my mum, my brother, my sister, my dog, and my cat. And I turn to them on a regular basis and ask them to guide me. And I'm constantly looking for guidance about whether I should be going down this area or going down this area. Anyway, so Tom Watson, so that's just the background of what was happening in 2012 when Tom Watson suddenly talked about the Jimmy Savile situation. So that did interest me, and I'd already had a lot of case books from people who were claiming that they were in care homes and that they had been abused, and there were lords and there were parliamentarians who were coming to pick them up in flash cars at the weekends and take them off to hotels where they were being filmed, and those films were being used to blackmail other politicians. I was like, this is insane. And the thing is it sounds insane because if you're not that way inclined, it's very hard to understand why somebody would want to harm a child in that way. It is extremely hard to understand that because decent people don't spend their time dwelling on the abuse of children. Well, you know what they say, and that is you have to be careful when you stare into the abyss because it will stare back at you. And what I've discovered in the last 10 years is it does. It absolutely does, and there have been some dark moments. So I started to explore the whole issue of paedophiles within the British establishment, and that took me down some very interesting roads. And I worked with a number of people who were absolutely at the forefront of that. And I would like to, David Icke, as one example, is somebody that he and I have clashed. We work together and, you know, we clash. But I always acknowledge the work that David put in regarding this area. And he was meticulous, actually. And David was one of the first people who came out and said, Edward Heath, our former Prime Minister, is not only a paedophile, but a murderer as well. And he put that in his book. I think it was The Biggest Secret. And that was 7 years before Edward Heath died. And Edward Heath didn't sue him. And I thought, this is really interesting because I'm telling you, somebody put in a book that I was doing those things, I wouldn't hesitate to sue them. And certainly somebody with the backup of Edward Heath. Now, having been in litigation for the last 4 years, I know that sometimes people aren't prepared to push certain areas of litigation because it may reveal certain things about them. And I can only assume that Edward Heath chose not to pursue David Icke for two reasons. One, the establishment had already tarred and feathered David Icke as a nutter, not to be taken seriously. So he was safe. So Edward Heath was safe there. But also, two, he was extremely concerned what would have come out at trial because it can be very thorough. And so that's why I think I am in no doubt that David was right about Edward Heath. And we saw that. And eventually I made a film called Paedophiles in Parliament. And this is a film that has caused me more headaches than anything else I've ever done. And I wouldn't change a thing. I have been pursued and stalked. I've been under police investigation and all manner of things, because that is what happens. And I'll tell you in a minute about the police investigation, but what was really interesting was when the police investigated me, they took me to the police station that was featured in Paedophiles in Parliament. And it was like, okay, this is interesting. I think there might be a message here for me. And they investigated me because they said that there was allegations that I had broken reporting restrictions, and it was to do with the Hampstead case. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Hampstead case. And in an interview with Sean Atwood, who is a podcaster you may also be familiar with, he had asked me about the Hampstead case. And it was not something that I'd ever really been involved in pushing or promoting, not at all. I'd taken very much a sort of a back role in watching how everything unfolded. And about 5-6 years after a judge had said, no, there's nothing to this, and these children, must not be identified, and all those things. Sean Atwood asked me about it, and I had a conversation with him, and everything was fine. And then, I don't know, weeks later, he put out the podcast, and everything was fine. The next thing I know, I get contacted by the police telling me that I am under investigation to do with the Hampstead case. And they say that in this video, I had said the 2 first names of the children. And that's true, I did, but it wasn't deliberate, it was by accident, and it was also under the assumption there was going to be an editor down the line as well, because it was a conversation. But it was just the 2 first names. But that situation, they came down on me like a ton of bricks. They put me under investigation for 6 months, but it was a warning. That's what it was. It was a warning. And then they announced at the end of it, no further action, everything's fine. But this was after quite extreme and intense pressure. And as I say, they took me to the police station that was featured in my film, Paedophiles in Parliament. So Paedophiles in Parliament was about 40 years of allegations within the British establishment, within royalty, within political circles. And the Jimmy Savile thing made me realise that maybe some people are above the law. We're always told, oh, they're not above the law. Well, I'm here to tell you, bollocks! People are above the law. They absolutely are, because I've seen it. And that is the reality. Not you or I. We're not above the law. We're absolutely not above the law. But there are people who are above the law. And what I discovered in making Paedophiles in Parliament, I spoke to police, I spoke to close protection officers, I spoke to MI5 and MI6 former agents, I spoke to survivors of child abuse, I spoke to politicians. This is the thing, is I go as far as I can to the source and to the people who were there and know these things. And I spoke to people who had accounts of how Margaret Thatcher, as one example, had been told by a close protection officer, Archie Hamilton, that her close assistant, Peter Morrison, had parties at the weekend where young boys were taken. And rather than her act on it, she then vouched for him to become a Sir. So all these things really I found very curious and very interesting. And then I realised actually dear old Maggie surrounded herself with paedophiles. Now I don't know why that is, but I do think it's worth asking, why would somebody have a lot of friends who have an extraordinary interest in children? And the thing is you don't get to be a Prime Minister without your team knowing everything about anybody who comes into your circle. So there is no way on earth anybody can ever tell me that the royal family and Margaret Thatcher did not know about Jimmy Savile. That is simply impossible, absolutely simply impossible. It would have been remiss of their close protection officers not to have informed them of the type of people they were moving with. So I absolutely maintain that the royal family, who were extremely close to Jimmy Savile, and Margaret Thatcher, who spent many Christmases at Chequers with Jimmy Savile, they absolutely knew who he was and what he stood for, which then led me to a further question, and that is, what is it that Jimmy Savile did for these people? What was it? And I had to conclude, eventually, it took me a long time. Paedophiles in Parliament actually took me 5 to 6 years to research, because I wanted it to be as spot on as humanly possible. And I had to conclude the same thing that David Icke concluded, and that was Jimmy Savile was a procurer of children for the British establishment. There's literally no other, and I've tried every angle possible, and the level of intelligence that has come to me is that, simply that. And so that formed the basis of Paedophiles in Parliament. And the Paedophiles in Parliament goes over many areas, including the police investigation into Edward Heath after his death. And Mike Veal at Wiltshire Police went through hell and high water to be able to do that investigation. The establishment, the moment that he announced he was going to be looking into the allegations to do with Edward Heath, the establishment came against him full force. Keith Vaz, who was a politician at the time, and has, if you watch Paedophiles in Parliament, you'll see that Keith Vaz has a very interesting history, including to do with Lord Janner, who was extensively accused of being a paedophile and was, like many of them, allowed to to die without charge, even though the police did admit that they had enough to charge him. 33 people, interesting number though, isn't it? 33 people came forward and said that he had been abusing them, and there were more afterwards. And what I found interesting about Lord Janos, one perfect example, was he was showing up in the House of Lords every day to pick up his £300 until the police announced their investigation, and suddenly he was too sick and he could no longer return to the House of Lords. And so all of those things are just so curious to me, so incredibly curious. And the Edward Heath investigation, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. So what you had was all these newspapers, establishment newspapers, literally rail against a police chief for investigating paedophile allegations, which I thought was extraordinary, because the man's just doing his job. Let him just do his job. And Mike Veal ended up having to make several extraordinary statements about what was happening to them, and I don't know if they're still available online, but they are in Paedophiles in Parliament. And he was saying, this is, you know, we're investigating, that's all we're doing. But people in the establishment were saying it was wrong. He shouldn't be investigating, but he did what he should have done. And I know we have lots of problems with the police. I know we do, but there are some good ones, actually. And Mike Veal was one of them, is one of them. And I've worked with a number of good police. I'm not for defunding the police, but I am for rooting out the bad apples, obviously. And clearly we've seen with the Metropolitan Police, there's rather a lot of bad apples. And they're problematic. But Mike Veal is a good guy, and he tried his very best, and he concluded in the end, which was very interesting, was that he had neither the evidence to say whether Edward Heath was a paedophile or not. So either way, he couldn't confirm it, one way or another, which the truth is, I think he left it like that because even though he couldn't nail it, he knew there was a truth to the rumours. He knew there was a truth to the rumours. And those rumours, for anybody who is familiar with them, are horrendous. And that was this idea that Edward Heath was going on his, he became very famous for yachting on the Morning Cloud. And the idea was, and there is pictorial evidence of this, that he would regularly go to Jersey and he would have boys delivered to his boat from Haute de la Garenne, which was the orphanage there. And they would be taken to his boat and they'd be sodomised, and then they would be killed and then they'd be thrown overboard. And that was the story that they said. And I found that absolutely extraordinary. But that was what they were investigating at Wiltshire Police. So they did feel there was enough there to investigate that. And they, at the end of it, they couldn't clear Edward Heath. They could not clear him. So that still remains as it is. He was uncleared of those allegations. But again, when you're decent, good people, it is almost impossible to imagine these things happening. But then I started to go a little bit further down the line and I started to explore Haute de la Garenne, and I found out that Jimmy Savile had threatened to sue a number of newspapers for saying that he had been at Haute de la Garenne, and one of them was The Sun. And so newspapers didn't publish that Jimmy Savile had been a regular at Haute de la Garenne, this orphanage. And then a picture emerged of Jimmy Savile on the front lawn at Haute de la Garenne, surrounded by some of the children. But that was all kept out of the public eye. And these are the things that exasperate me as a journalist. I'm an old school journalist. I'm a bit publish and be damned, which you can't do anymore. But I do believe that once you've done as much due diligence as you humanly can, not to tar and feather innocent people, because it's horrendous to be an innocent person accused of a heinous crime. But if there is substantial evidence to suggest that there is something there, the very least that should happen is we should explore it. And if the police aren't going to explore it, then me as an investigative journalist should explore it. And so that was why I made Paedophiles in Parliament. And as I say, the world rained down on me. I made that, it was 2018. Since then I've been subject to all manner of things. And it's fine, because honestly, what kind of an investigative journalist would I be if I wasn't pissing people off? I'd be a crappy investigative journalist. It comes with the territory. You have to. And, I think it was George Orwell, wasn't it? He said that journalism is, I'm paraphrasing it badly, but printing what others don't want, anything else is public relations. Well, I don't do public relations. I do journalism, and proudly so. And unfortunately, we have a world now which is our journalism is largely reliant on public relations. And perfect example of that, of course, was the COVID era. Absolutely. I'm sure most people in this room are absolutely awake to what's taken place over the last 4 years. But the truth is that we were subject to a massive psyop. That is what happened to us. And it was propped up and backed by our media. And our media were completely compromised because during 2020 and 2021, there was a gap in advertising. People were not wanting to advertise in the media. Well, because of what was happening, people were in lockdown, and so there was a problem in terms of the budget of advertising in the media. But the biggest advertiser was the government with our taxpayer money, frightening us. And so the media were entirely compromised to go along with the official narrative. At that time, I had then been at ITN for 8 years as a consultant and contributing editor. My job was to bring in stories that nobody else was covering, and one of the stories that I brought in was about the contaminated blood scandal. And I'd gone to Oxford with people from the contaminated blood campaign, and nobody was listening to them, and nobody was believing what they'd been through. And they were supposed to be having a meeting with David Cameron. He was in power at that time, and then when he heard I was there, he refused to meet them. Well, a journalist was there. He wasn't happy that media had come along, and I was there in Oxford with people who had been given blood that was contaminated and they were dying, and our Prime Minister was refusing to have a meeting with them. So I said, what do you want to do? And they said, we want him to receive this literature. And so myself and a cameraman took Glenn, who was the head of the campaign, to David Cameron's house, and we faced off with armed guards. The video was online and the guns were like this. And they said, what do you think you're doing? I said, we're going to put the literature through his door. They said, you're not doing that. And I said, watch me. And so Glenn and I did it together, and that was a wonderful feeling, because the thing is that I was right there with somebody who was suffering as a consequence of the government. It was the government who enabled the contaminated blood scandal to happen. They knew what was happening. We were buying in blood from Skid Row in America, from heroin addicts and people with HIV, and it was absolutely disastrous. And we've all seen the consequences of that now. So that was my job at ITN, to bring in stories that nobody else was covering. And of course, the whole contaminated blood scandal now, it's absolutely out in the open, it's exposed, it's been happening all over the world, and we know about it. But ITN were not happy with me talking about COVID so publicly and questioning it, because they were compromised. And ITN supplies the news shows for ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, and a myriad of other terrestrial and satellite broadcasters. So they're powerful. And I was given a talk, and the talk entailed, do you intend to carry on like this on social media? And I said, what do you mean? What do you mean? Well, some of the things that you're saying are not necessarily right, because obviously you could be considered a health hazard with some of the things you're saying, because you're not allowing people to be protected. And I said, I don't believe any of that. Absolutely not. I believe my story is to say, hey, we've got an issue here. Let's raise awareness to this. And that's what I was doing. So I was given a choice between stopping and keeping my job, or continuing and walking out the door. Guess which one I chose? I left immediately, because I could not be in that situation where I couldn't talk about something which seemed so obviously to be harming people. And so all of these things are just sort of side issues that we're not allowed to, they're not even side issues, they actually should be front and centre. We should have been allowed at that time, via our broadcast media and our print media, to ask all the questions that people like you and I were asking. That should have been allowed. Instead, we were demonised. And honestly, it was an absolute failure of journalism during the COVID years, no doubt about it. So I'm not interested in journalists now, whether that's Piers Morgan or Jeremy Vine or any of them, suddenly going, oh, well, there might be a point there. No, there was always a point there, and your job was to be curious about it. It's no good being curious after the fact when we know that people have been maimed and murdered as a consequence of experimental gene therapy and all manner of other things that accompanied the COVID measures. And that is what we should have been talking about, rather than social distancing, lockdown, and all those other things. We should never have gone into lockdown. There is nothing in any UK pandemic preparedness about lockdown, right? We knew that we were in lockstep. And those of us who are awake, and I don't like that word awake, but I can't think of a better one, but so those of us who are awake, that the world is not necessarily what we're being told it is, we wanted to spread that word. We wanted to get it out. And we also don't want to be put into that situation ever again. And look at all the things that have led from COVID now. Suddenly, the WHO want us to have a pandemic accord, a pandemic agreement about how we do this in future, which would come down to the one person at the top of the WHO when they decide that we should all be locking down again. But it's really important to be outspoken about these things, because I work on the basis of each one, teach one. You don't have to be a journalist with a platform in order to be able to help and educate people. You can literally educate your neighbour. You literally can. I talk to people in supermarket queues, when I'm queuing up anywhere, wherever I can, I will get chatting to them. And it's amazing what can be achieved with those simple discussions. So that's a little bit of background. And I want to come to one of the investigations that still means so much. Well, obviously, the investigation of paedophiles within the British establishment clearly means a great deal to me. I met Dr. Joan Coleman. Anybody here familiar with the RAINS list? Dr. Joan Coleman in the 80s and 90s was demonised by mainstream media. It was during the time when they said there was a satanic panic. And Dr. Joan Coleman was the doctor at the heart of it all. And it was Dr. Joan Coleman who pulled together the RAINS list. And the RAINS list is a list of extremely famous, extremely influential people. And I don't know the veracity of it, but all I can tell you is what Joan told me and how she came to pulling together the RAINS list. And the notion was that on the RAINS list, this was a list of people in all areas of life, banking, media, celebrity, public people, who were involved in satanic ritual abuse regarding children. And so I went to visit Joan when I was making Paedophiles in Parliament, because, as I say, I like to go to the source. Everybody was telling me about the RAINS list, but I was like, who made it? Let me talk to this person. And so I eventually got to go and see Joan in the Surrey Hills. And what she told me absolutely convinced me of the veracity of what she was saying. She said, first of all, she had never put anybody's name on that list unless there were several independent witnesses to it. Now, Joan was the doctor who was being sent children who were troubled. So this was her job in the 80s and 90s. She was working with very, very troubled, disturbed children who were saying all these things were happening to them, etc., etc. And sometimes the schools were bringing in Joan to talk to these children as well, because these were troubled children. And Joan was discovering that these children were being abused ritualistically by members of the British establishment. And one of them was a girl who we shall call Mooch. Mooch was the sister of who eventually became Joan's partner. And Mooch had said that to her brother that a stepfather was taking her away at the weekends to be abused by Freemasons in the countryside, and Edward Heath was involved in this. And Joan decided to test this out. So Mooch was young. She was, 11, 12. She was very young. And so what they did, Mooch said, I can take you exactly to the place. I can describe it exactly. I can show you where they would let the children out the back and set the dogs on us to come and track us down and bring us back, because there was this whole idea they have blooded children and all these. All of this was insane to me. And I'm sure to some of you this might sound insane, but there are insane people out there with insane objectives. Anyway, they took Mooch to this place. She literally guided them in the car. And everything she had told them, and there's no way on earth this child could have known about the layout of this property without having been there. And her brother knew nothing about this. And Mooch was able to show Dr. Joan and her brother everything, the area of everything that she said had happened to her. And so Joan said to me, that's what happened. And that was what convinced Joan that there really was satanic ritual abuse within the British establishment, because Mooch was absolutely very serious that Edward Heath was involved and was there for their, because it wasn't just children who were being abused either, it was also animals. And that was what was taking place at this kind of, lodge at some weekends. So Joan was seeing all these children, but she wouldn't add anybody's name to the list unless there were several independent children. They didn't meet each other unless several children had said, yeah, this person was involved. And that was how the Rains list came to be. And I know that there's often been a lot of chatter about the Rains list. It's available online and people wonder how true it is. And I don't know. That's the reality, which is why I'm not going to say any of the names on it, because not least I don't understand defamation. But I do know that the person who compiled it had credibility. And I say had because 9 months after I visited Joan, she died. And what was actually wonderful, and I felt really blessed about, was Joan had been dragged through mainstream media in the 90s. They absolutely demonized her. They tried to destroy her practice. They did all manner of things. They said that she was at the heart of the satanic panic and she was the problem and all of these things, when in fact she had come and she was trying to rectify situations. But we know our world, it's inverted, right? And that is, the good ones are deemed bad, and we understand how that works. And so Joan had said to me in that meeting that it had been very hard to live through that. But what was gratifying for her was, with the advent of the internet, there was a whole new slew of sleuths who could follow up on her work. And that gave her such heart and encouragement, because she felt that her work wasn't just going to die with her. She knew she was going to be leaving the earth soon. I don't know if she necessarily knew it was going to be so soon afterwards, but I felt very blessed to have met her. And it was really Joan who convinced me, the final thing, that I absolutely was going to go through with the making of Paedophiles in Parliament. So that was one investigation. But the other investigation that means a lot to me, because I believe it is one of our biggest cover-ups, and that is the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. It is, without a shadow of a doubt, one of our biggest cover-ups, and we know that. And we also know that a series of prime ministers and home secretaries are implicated. And they're implicated because year on year, they keep allowing us to fund Operation Grange, which is the British investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine, which is approximately now 14 million in the hole. And so far, we've had one German patsy, who they are so determined to try and make they said, #1 suspect since 2020. And even though he's currently in court in Germany about other charges, they've even attempted to bring in nonsense to do with Madeleine. Well, I would put money on it that Christian Bruckner had absolutely nothing to do with the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. And I looked into the story of Madeleine McCann. I went to the scene of crime twice. I talked to people in Praia de Luz, which obviously in Portugal, where Madeleine was reported missing. And I always say about May the 3rd, 2007, which is like the official date, I always say she was reported missing. I don't say that was when Madeleine disappeared, because I don't actually know that was the date she disappeared. And there is a great deal of discrepancy about whether that is the date she disappeared. But I maintain that the Portuguese police files are largely correct. And that is, sadly, poor Madeleine died in that apartment. She never left there alive. And I have, deeply questioned for a very, very long time, practically actually from the beginning, the abduction theory. And we've gone along with it, and our prime ministers and our home secretaries are all implicated. And I believe that the reason that Operation Grange continues to get funded year on year, year in, year out, is because to stop it is when the stuff hits the fan. That is when we can start asking questions and filing all the different pieces of information that we need to, that we should be allowed to ask about. And so I believe that they're just going to keep rolling it on, keep rolling it on. And unfortunately, that is where we are. We're in a world where we are told A, but we really all know that it's probably B. And we're in a run-up to a general election. I've never known such loathing towards the political classes as there is now. And I think that is a consequence of a number of things. And one of that is the COVID period, where almost all of the politicians were implicated in the draconian, tyrannical measures. I mean, this was medical tyranny writ large, but it was more than that. This was about controlling every step of the way. And if there's anybody in here that is not familiar with the UN Agenda 2030, please do look it up. 17 goals, sustainable development, and almost everything that we are being subjected to in a very draconian way is all about fulfilling that, because they've all bought into it, all of the globalists. You saw them this week at G7, and they're that, you know, people who are supposed to detest each other. Georgia Maloney and Rishi Sunak look like they've been sleeping together. They look great mates. But that's what it is. It's absolutely ridiculous, but we know it. And a very famous astrologer who's now dead, Jonathan Kaner, once said at a talk that I went to, he said, in the future, everything will become so much more transparent and you will be able to see in real time as it's happening. And that is the truth. And what's so great about the internet, because I think the internet is great. I understand there are lots of problems attached to it. But the fact is, we wouldn't be here today without the internet, chances are. And so it's enabled a lot of truth seekers to be able to get the word out there and for us not to feel alone, because just by a show of hands, when you went through the period of your awakening, how lonely and isolated did you feel? How did you? Tell me that. Yeah? Look at that, because that is the most common feeling, because we're made to feel as if there's something mentally wrong with us the moment we start to ask questions. But the truth is, the chances are we're the ones who are actually right. And the last thing they need is for us to realise it. So, we're going to have a little break, and then we're going to do a Q&A. Ask me whatever you want, but if it is something that you would like a personal response to, wait until after the Q&A. I'll be hanging around. Feel free to come up, ask me some questions if you don't want them to be part of the Q&A. But really, as far as the Q&A goes, go for it. Whatever it is that is interesting you about any of those things. You know, I'm just seeing if there's anything else that I wanted to mention before. Oh, this was interesting. I saw an interview. And it was with Bev Turner, and I saw this morning in the flat. It was an interview with Bev Turner and Charlotte Griffiths from the Mail on Sunday, and they were discussing Kate coming out for the Trooping of the Colours. And it was horrible. It made me sick, just the language they were using. Oh, she's a model, and well, with her on the public stage, the world seems so much more drab and everything. It's like, really? But what was interesting was what Charlotte Griffiths said. She said, and I quote her, she said, "The press have made a pact not to talk about Kate." And I thought that is interesting, because the last time I heard that somebody had made a pact, it was to do with Madeleine McCann. And when they make a pact, it means that they want a group of people to be in and they want the rest of us to be out. My job is to take us into their world and expose them for what they are, so that we all stand a chance of living our life to the fullest. So I'm going to take a break here right now. Let's have a drink.